Obviously, if you're gonna make a horror game, you're gonna have some scares sprinkled throughout the journey. So that naturally begs the question, how does one go about making scares in their horror game? Well, some might think it's just a matter of sprinkling in jump scares throughout a game. I mean, it works, doesn't it? The goal is to frighten the player after all. Well, I have to disagree there. Yes, it will elicit a reaction, but I personally find jump scares too simple and cheap. They often take minimal effort and no build-up, and leave the player feeling more frustrated than scared. Personally, I would never resort to such tactics. I would never, ever, in a video game or a video, decide to randomly jump scare you just to get a cheap reaction. It's beneath me. Pinky promise. You see how much more fun building up dread is? That method of scaring the player focused more on giving them something to dread over time rather than simply assaulting their senses is the kind of fear I want to inject into my horror game. So for this devlog, I'm going to talk about how I go about this style of horror, what preparation is required, how I steadily build up a player's worry over time, and of course, the eventual climax of the scare. My name is Lance, aka Infinite Level, and I'm making a horror game titled What Hides in Dreams, Where Death Leaves Scars. First, we ought to break down the kinds of scares there are in horror games. Broadly speaking, there's two kinds of scares. There's the slow burn, long form type of scare where dread is built up over time, with the hints that something is off becoming more and more obvious as you progress. This is the sort of thing games like Silent Hill rely upon to build up their horror. On the complete opposite end of that, there's the short, quick, and dirty scares that often don't connect to any larger scare later on. This is the domain of jump scares, but it doesn't strictly have to be a jump scare. It can be more subtle things like a door opening on its own, or some bug-eyed, fish-smelling creep looking at you funny. The point is, these smaller scares likely won't directly relate to something yet to come the way, say, a mauled corpse might. Now, the astute among you might be thinking that long-form scares are ultimately a series of short-form scares, right? And you're not wrong. Oftentimes, a minor event is used to quietly announce that something bad is about to happen, and then later small things build up to a big spooky thing. If we use Five Nights at Freddy's as an example, the first minor event that kicks things off is a legal disclaimer, saying that Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for damage to property or a person. Yeah. And of course, we all know what comes after that. Oh yeah! But I make the distinction because short-form scares don't strictly need to build up to anything. They exist to keep you on edge and are kind of a payoff in and of themselves, where long-form scares typically require more pieces to pull off and tend to lead to some big thing. As I break down how I do horror events in my game, you'll definitely see a lot of short-form scares used to build up to some climax, but I have plenty of frights in my game that solely exist to be a minor scare and is not intended to imply anything further. So on to the actual structuring of a scare then. Horror has a surprising amount of similarities to comedy, and like a good joke, you begin everything with the setup. Take a look at this scene from the very beginning of my prison level. It features the player walking down this oddly winding prison hall, seeing faceless prisoners reach out and make noise to spook you, but not outright scare you. It all leads up to you walking into a cell of your own, where the door behind you suddenly closes, trapping you inside. Next thing you know, the lights start to go off one by one until you're shrouded in darkness all by yourself. Then, you hear footsteps. They start to get closer, and there's a shout, and then you're somewhere else. The whole sequence is designed to ultimately set the tone of the level to come, and to give a small tease of what the monster may be like, while also giving the player a chance to see and understand these prisoner characters that will come back later. The whole sequence, in a way, is a short-form scare that's building into the long-form scare of the eventual monster encounter, but even by itself, it's a condensed version of the cycle I'll be talking about. It kicks things off with a minor horror event where some guy's making sobbing sounds in the dark. It's creepy, but it doesn't really mean anything. But then you see the prisoners and said prisoners kind of accompany you to your own cell where the final scare occurs before the level begins in earnest. The whole point of this sequence is to set up the player's expectations for the remainder of the level. The prisoners will be an element, there's evidently a large monster to worry about judging by those footsteps, and of course, we're stuck inside an enclosed space with God knows what. By the end of this setup, the player's imagination should have begun to work its magic, and we horror game devs love it when that happens. These starting sections are kind of fun to make because I can do just about whatever I want in them, as long as it's thematically cohesive with the remainder of the level. But the main level, the part where you're collecting items, solving puzzles, and avoiding monsters the way an intensely introverted person avoids interaction with other people, hello, it's me, I'm the introvert in this story. Well, now the scares have to start abiding by the rules of the level design. The office level in my game is a solid example of how level design can influence what scares I put in a level. So in this level, the monster's main gimmick is the use of minions, simply known as workers. They can alert the monster to your presence and trigger an admittedly jump scare like horror event whenever you get near them. That's important because this does mean that the workers can themselves be horror events, and so there's less of a need to put in other scares to build up to the eventual monster because these guys kind of already do that. Contrast that with the old house level, where the monster is invisible for a while, so you need to add tension in other ways. There's a scare in this level where you can see the monster briefly in this red-colored room before she suddenly disappears. This whole scare exists as it is because of the way the level is designed. It wouldn't be possible in other parts of the same level, or if it is possible in other places, it would be less effective. It's also needed because, as I said, there's far fewer opportunities to build up this monster's eventual appearance. You generally don't want horror events interfering with the player solving puzzles, after all. And with some exceptions, you usually want the scare to be visible, so you have to factor in the level's floor plan when deciding where you want your scares to occur. There's also potential for scares tied to item collection or unlocking a room, and it's also important to factor in scares that can or cannot occur when the monster is active and hunting the player. That's especially true in my game, where levels aren't exactly linear, and certain events can happen in differing orders depending on a player's individual playthrough. Yeah, good job, me. Way to open that Pandora's box. But okay, the level design is made, and I've come up with some scary events that will work well within the greater design. We've already talked about how one can begin to set up a scare, so how about the middle part that leads up to our big final scare? In other words, how do we build and maintain tension? This part's tricky. Obviously, you can't jump from the setup straight into the final scare. That'd be lame and stupid. You have to slowly escalate the fear over time. This is often where atmosphere and setting can do a lot of the heavy lifting for me. I've hopefully established a reason or two to be nervous during the opening minutes, so now I use atmospheric noise, story, and environmental visuals to maintain the fear. The dungeon level might be my personal favorite level in this regard because it pulls off this maintenance in an admittedly simple way. After getting a peek at the monster, all I do to maintain dread is play a simple droning noise in the background, which replaces the typical music. The composition ain't much, but in my humble opinion, it's dang near perfect for keeping the player on edge. Music is just one tool, however. Ideally, the combination of music, setting, and the occasional bit of short-form scares will all come together to put the player on high alert, building up a kind of pressure inside the player before eventually releasing that pressure with a climax. Don't make that weird. The climax of fear is the thing our previous teasing has been building up towards. In horror games, we tend to think of that as the monster appearing before the player and attempting to give the player a great big hug. Once the monster is prowling, the gameplay loop itself is a series of setup, building tension, and then climax. The setup, of course, is the monster walking about, the tension is when they're nearby or otherwise notice you, and the climax is when they give chase. But scares in a horror game don't have to end with a monster trying to take a bite out of your plump, juicy butt. Sometimes the payoff is surrounding the player in darkness after picking up an important item, igniting a new kind of fear. Other times it's doing some action that's creepy and unsettling. The point is that just because there's monsters doesn't mean the monster always needs to be the punchline, so to speak. There's a lot of ways to cap off a sequence of horror events, and while monster encounters will almost inevitably be the most common, it doesn't strictly need to be that way. That red room I talked about with the old house level is an example of a climax that doesn't necessarily have the monster lunging after your lovely face to give you a sloppy smooch. It is a climax in the sense that In most cases, it's going to be the first time you get an actual hint of the monster being nearby. You've spent the level thus far seeing some short-form scares and building an understanding that this place ain't right, only to get confirmation by seeing her before she quickly disappears. That's the climax, which doubles as a kind of setup, and now the building of dread begins anew. The process will repeat until this time she's actually wandering around and thinking you look like a tasty snack. Now, I've been talking about the climax like it's the end of the scaring process. Congratulations, you frightened the player! Mission accomplished, right? Well, not exactly. There's actually a key step that must be taken to truly complete the cycle, and that's relief. In a lot of horror games, that can sometimes be finding an important resource like lamp oil or ammo, but in my game, relief really doesn't come often mid-level. It might arrive in small doses after solving a puzzle or successfully evading a monster after getting their attention, but that's about all you get while you're in the thick of it. This could definitely be a major weakness in my game if I'm not careful, so to help counter this, I have a map dedicated to being a safe space, the level selection map. It might not look like a pleasant place to be in, but I think players will really come to appreciate this space as they play my game. Much like the save rooms of Resident Evil games, this is an area where you can take time to collect yourself, enjoy a little atmosphere free of imminent threats, and generally be calm. It's important to have a moment like this because without it, the game would be a constant stream of scares, and after a while that constant stream would eventually get old. So in my game, I let the player wander the house, check out story stuff, and reflect on what just happened before they eventually decide to open the next door and succumb themselves to even more horrors. And that's the basic loop. For me in my game, my intended scare trajectory looks roughly like the graph here, though this isn't an exact science and can definitely vary from one level to the next. But something else I want to talk about is a scare's scope. I've spent this devlog explaining how scares are generally broken down into setup, building tension, climax, and then relief, and the ways those stages are achieved. Something I've not drawn much attention to is the scope of a scare. If we go back to that prison sequence earlier in the video, I mentioned that this sequence is something of a condensed version of the scare process. The setup is initially entering the level, followed by the tension from the prisoners, before a climax with the cell at the end. And technically there is a brief relief period too, though the player may not necessarily know that. This is all done in the span of a couple minutes, but the sequence also acts as a general setup for the much larger scare, which is the monster making its grand appearance later in the level. This intro to the prison level is a complete scare, but it's a scare with a relatively small scope. That feeds into a scare with a larger scope, the monster's imminent arrival. And really, the entire game is basically one long scare sequence stretched out over a handful of levels. Think about it. The opening moments are the setup, playing through levels is the build-up, and the game's finale would be the climax, and then the ending and credits would ultimately be your relief. Things get extra interesting for me since in my game, death leaves scars, which if you're new here basically means that death by monster or killing the monster affects the game's story. So now, the ultimate scare loop gets even more tense as the player plays through levels and gets different outcomes. Knowing that their actions, or lack thereof, can have consequences will aid in scaring them further when things don't go their way, or when they do something they thought correct only for the story to reveal that they actually did something really terrible. At least, that's the theory. In summary, set things up first to give the player something to think about in the back of their minds as they peruse the environment, then use your setting and atmosphere to reinforce their own fears, then finally end with the climax, be it monster arrival or something else, before giving them a moment of relief and then doing it all over again. This has been the pattern as I make my own game, and if you look at some of the best horror games, you'll notice that this pattern appears often. Now obviously, different people find different things scary. Some people get really bored if there's no immediate threat at virtually all times, while others, such as myself, hate constant jump scares. The nice thing about this pattern is that it is capable of casting a pretty wide net. Lovers of slow burns will appreciate the moments focused on atmosphere instead of outright scares, while still giving thrill seekers enough highs to keep them engaged. This is a helpful pattern that I personally abide by, but the exact timings and how one goes about setting up these scares is, of course, going to vary from one game to the next. Well, I think I've covered everything I wanted to. Of course, I'm going to plug my stuff because this is my channel and I can say whatever I want, within reason. But before I do that, why don't you scroll on down to the comments there and discuss some games you think use this approach well.
And while you're at it, if you like this video, then a like is appreciated, and if you really like this video, then you might be interested in subscribing to my channel for future devlogs. Oh, you're curious what game I would say uses this pattern well? Funny you should ask. I'm making a horror game called What Hides in Dreams, which I've been showing very prominently in this here video. If you think it looks cool, or you've been intrigued by my thoughts on how to scare the player, then I would appreciate you taking the time to head on over to Steam and wishlisting the game. As always, link is in the description below. Thank you very much for watching, watch out for jump scares, and until next time.